When most people think of Sparta, they think of one word: Spartan. And in modern English, that word means exactly what you'd expect. Simple, stripped down, no frills. A Spartan meal, a Spartan lifestyle. The word exists because we assume ancient Sparta was the ultimate no-nonsense, everyone is equal, suffer-together society. Warriors who slept on hard beds, ate disgusting black soup, and owned nothing except their shield and their reputation. Here's the problem. That image is almost completely wrong. The real Sparta wasn't a society of equals all suffering together. It was one of the most brutally hierarchical, rigidly stratified, slave-dependent societies in the ancient world. The warriors you see in movies, those chiseled, red-cloaked, spear-carrying machines, they were the top of a pyramid so steep it would make a Wall Street banker uncomfortable. And here's the detail that tells you everything you need to know about how that pyramid worked. When a Spartan warrior went to war, he didn't go alone. He brought 7 servants with him. 7 per warrior into active combat. Let that sink in for a second. Today we're going to find out why and what that number reveals about one of history's most misunderstood civilizations. Let's start with where the myth comes from, because it's not entirely made up. Sparta did have a culture of austerity, at least for a specific group of people. Spartan citizens were forbidden from owning gold and silver. They were required to eat communal meals together rather than dining privately at home like rich people. They trained together, suffered together, and were expected to display no more wealth than their neighbor. This is where the modern idea of Spartan comes from. And for the people it applied to, it was real. But here's what the textbooks conveniently leave out. This egalitarian code only applied to a tiny fraction of the population. Spartan citizens, the people we actually call Spartans, made up somewhere between 3% and 5% of the total population living in Spartan territory. 3 to 5%. That means for every one person enjoying this famous Spartan lifestyle, there were 19 or 20 other people who were decidedly not enjoying it. Not equal, not citizens, not warriors. They were, in many cases, literally enslaved. Spartan society ran on 3 distinct groups of people, and understanding all 3 is the only way to understand why a warrior needed 7 servants. At the top, the Spartiates. These were the full citizens, the ones we call Spartans. They trained from childhood, they voted in assemblies, they fought in the phalanx, they ate the famous black broth that ancient sources describe as genuinely revolting. One visiting king reportedly tasted it and said he finally understood why Spartans weren't afraid to die. These men owned land, but here's the catch. They were forbidden from farming it themselves. Manual labor was considered incompatible with the life of a warrior. A Spartiate who spent his day plowing fields would be too tired to train, too distracted to fight, and frankly, too dirty to be taken seriously at the communal dinner. So who farmed the land? That brings us to Tier 2, the Helots. The Helots were the state-owned serfs of Sparta, the people whose labor made the entire Spartan military machine possible. They were not slaves in the Roman sense, purchased as property. They were something arguably worse. An entire ethnic population, mainly the conquered people of the region of Messenia, reduced to permanent agricultural servitude with no path to freedom and no protection under law. Every single year, not once, not occasionally, every year, the Spartan government formally declared war on the Helots. Not because the Helots had done anything, not because there had been a revolt or an attack. Just as a routine administrative act, Sparta would legally declare that its own agricultural workforce was an enemy combatant population. Why? Because this legal declaration meant that killing a Helot was not a crime. It could not be prosecuted. It required no justification. A Spartan citizen could kill a helot and face zero legal consequences because the state had already pre-authorized it. But it gets darker. Sparta ran a program called the Krypteia. Young Spartan warriors, as part of their official training, as a graduation requirement, were sent out into the countryside at night, alone, armed with only a knife. Their mission was to find and kill helots. Not enemy soldiers, not criminals, helots, the people who grew the food, and specifically, helot leaders. Any helot who showed signs of intelligence, charisma, organizational ability, or the kind of quiet authority that might inspire others, that person was a target. The Krypteia wasn't just cruelty. It was systematic decapitation of any potential resistance movement before it could form. It was the ancient world's version of a counterinsurgency program, except the insurgents hadn't done anything yet. Sparta was killing the people who might someday cause a problem. Think about what it takes to build a society where that is a normal part of growing up. Where your teenage sons disappear into the night with a knife and come back having murdered someone, and this is considered a rite of passage. Where the government requires this of you not because of an emergency, but because the emergency never ends. The Helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by somewhere between 7-1 and 15-1. Sparta was not sitting on top of a hostile population. Sparta was drowning in one. Every single day was a controlled emergency. Every year's declaration of war was an acknowledgement that the situation was one bad harvest, one charismatic leader, one moment of weakness away from catastrophe. This is the shadow war nobody talks about. While Greece was fighting Persia, while Athens was building the Parthenon, while philosophers were inventing logic and democracy, Sparta was fighting a different war. Every night, in its own backyard, against the people who made its breakfast. That is the foundation the famous Spartan warrior stood on. Then there's Tier 3, the Perioikoi, free non-citizens, craftsmen, merchants, traders, who lived in their own communities around Sparta's territory. They paid taxes, served in the army when required, and had no political rights whatsoever. They made things, sold things, owned businesses, all the economic activities that Spartiates were too busy being warriors to bother with. They were free, but they were not Spartan. They existed in the middle, neither enslaved nor equal, useful, but invisible. Now we're ready to answer the question. When Herodotus, the ancient historian, the father of history, described the Greek forces at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, he recorded something that stopped ancient readers in their tracks. The Spartan contingent consisted of 5,000 Spartan citizen warriors. Behind them, 35,000 helot servants. 7 per warrior. Every single Spartiate who marched to that battle brought 7 helots with him. What were they doing? Everything the warrior himself was too important to do. They carried equipment. A Spartan warrior's full kit weighed between 50 and 70 pounds. You don't carry 70 pounds of bronze for 20 miles and then immediately fight at peak performance. That's not tactics. That's just exhaustion. The servants carried it. They set up camp. They cooked food. They attended to wounds. They carried the dead home. Because Spartan law required that warriors be buried in their homeland, and the servants were there to make that possible. But here's the thing that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Those servants were helots. The same people Sparta declared war on every year. The same people young Spartan warriors were trained to hunt and kill in the night. And now those same people were marching behind Sparta's army, armed at least minimally, because you cannot send people into a war zone completely defenseless, carrying the weapons of the men whose government had legal authority to murder them without consequence. That is the arrangement Sparta made work for centuries. And the fact that it worked, that Helots marched to Plataea and did not turn on their Spartiate masters, says something important about how total, how complete, and how psychologically devastating the system of Spartan control actually was. When you have been systematically hunted since before you were born, when every leader your community has ever produced has quietly disappeared in the night, when you have no legal status and no path to freedom and no memory of a time when things were different, the idea of organized resistance becomes almost unthinkable. That was the point. That was always the point.
Taking 7 servants to war was also a statement. It was Sparta broadcasting to every ally and every enemy watching exactly how seriously it took the status of its warrior class. A Spartiate was too valuable, too trained, too irreplaceable to be distracted by anything except fighting. Think of how a head of state travels. They don't carry their own luggage, book their own flights, or make their own coffee. Not because they're physically incapable, but because their time and energy is considered too valuable to spend on logistics. Sparta applied this exact logic to warfare. A Spartiate's job was to fight. Everything else was someone else's problem. Here's where it gets complicated. Because the servant system didn't just reveal Sparta's military genius, it also revealed Sparta's most fundamental weakness. Those 35,000 Helots who marched to Plataea, they were there, armed, in a war zone, far from the surveillance network that kept them controlled at home. And that raised a question that every Spartan general had to confront. What exactly is stopping these 35,000 people from turning around? The answer, most of the time, was a combination of surveillance, terror, and the calculated judgment that cooperation was safer than rebellion. But it was never a comfortable answer, and it meant that Sparta could never fully commit its military to foreign adventures without worrying about what was happening at home. This is why Sparta was chronically reluctant to send armies far from Greek territory. Every Spartan king who proposed a major overseas campaign had to face the same internal argument. If we take our warriors out of the country, who keeps the Helots in line? The Persian king Xerxes had 300,000 soldiers. Sparta could have contributed far more to the Greek resistance if not for the permanent threat sitting in its own backyard. It's one of history's great ironies. The system that made Spartan warriors so fearsome, the servants, the total freedom from economic distraction, the complete focus on combat, was built on a foundation that made Sparta strategically paralyzed whenever it looked beyond its own borders. The most dangerous army in the ancient world was chained to its own front door. At the Battle of Plataea, the Spartan citizen contingent of 5,000 men, supported by their 35,000 servants, anchored the right flank of the Greek line against Persia's most elite units. The cavalry that had smashed armies across 3 continents, the Immortals, the legendary Royal Guard. The Spartans broke them completely. The Persian commander Mardonius was killed in the fighting. The Persian army dissolved. Greek casualties on the Spartan flank? 91 men. The system worked. 7 servants per warrior, a lifetime of training, a society that had organized every single aspect of its existence around producing the most effective combat unit in the ancient world. It worked exactly as designed. The price was paid by the Helots who carried the shields and cooked the food and buried the dead. The price was paid by the Perioikoi who made the armor and were never allowed to vote. The price was paid by a society that consumed itself, keeping its warriors pure, and by the people who were consumed. Aristotle, who had the benefit of hindsight and a philosopher's instinct for structural weakness, called the Helot system a permanent source of instability, a disaster waiting to happen. And eventually, he was right. Sparta's power collapsed not on a foreign battlefield, but from within. A series of Helot revolts, a catastrophic earthquake that killed thousands of Spartiates, a declining citizen population that could never recover its numbers because the requirements for citizenship were so demanding that fewer and fewer men qualified each generation. The pyramid got top-heavy and fell.